May 1944. The jungle along the Driniumor River in New Guinea held the particular density of equatorial forest that absorbed sound and light in equal measure. A green ceiling so complete overhead that the men moving beneath it experienced something closer to dusk than to the bright tropical noon that existed somewhere above the canopy they could not see. The Japanese infantry squad advancing through that undergrowth that afternoon moved with the disciplined caution of men who had trained for jungle warfare with genuine seriousness, who understood the tactical value of dispersion and concealment, and who had survived, to that point in the war, through exactly the kind of careful, methodical movement that their training had emphasized. They had been briefed on American firepower. They had encountered American rifle fire, mortar fire, the artillery that the American logistical system could deliver in quantities that Japanese gunners found professionally humbling. What they had not fully incorporated into their tactical calculations, in the specific and immediate sense that the next several seconds would require, was the particular character of automatic weapons fire delivered from a man-portable platform that one soldier could carry, aim, and fire from a standing or kneeling position with a rate and a sustained volume that the squad's collective experience had not adequately prepared them to anticipate. The American Browning automatic rifle opened fire from a position in the undergrowth that the advancing Japanese squad had not detected. In the span of perhaps 4 seconds, the duration of a single sustained burst from a 20-round magazine, fired with the controlled discipline that bar gunners were trained to maintain rather than the uncontrolled spray that popular imagination sometimes attributes to automatic weapons fire. The squad's forward element was reduced from a functioning tactical unit to a scattering of dead and wounded men whose survivors were treated in a disorder that the unit's training had not anticipated they would ever need to manage. The Japanese officer commanding the patrol, reviewing what had happened in the after-action assessment that Imperial military protocol required, confronted a tactical reality that his training, his doctrine, and his accumulated combat experience had not adequately prepared him to explain. One weapon, one man, one burst, and a squad that had existed as a coherent fighting unit moments earlier no longer existed in any operationally meaningful sense. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. To understand why this experience registered with the particular shock that Japanese after-action reports document with consistency across the New Guinea, Pacific Island, and Philippine campaigns, one must understand both the specific technical characteristics of the Browning automatic rifle and the broader doctrinal framework within which Japanese infantry tactics had developed through the pre-war and early war periods. The BAR, formerly the M1918, in its various modified configurations that American ordnance had refined through the interwar years and into the early war period, was not, in the most literal technical sense, a revolutionary weapon. It had been designed during the First World War, and its basic operating principle, a gas-operated automatic action firing the standard .30-06 rifle cartridge from a detachable box magazine, represented engineering that was by 1944 a quarter-century old. What made the BAR's battlefield effect so disproportionate to its technical novelty was not the weapon in isolation, but the specific tactical context into which American infantry doctrine had inserted it, and a specific contrast that context produced when measured against the doctrine and equipment of the Japanese infantry squad it was being employed against. Japanese infantry squad organization in the early and middle years of the Pacific War was built around the light machine gun as its principal source of sustained firepower, typically the Type 96 or Type 99 light machine gun, weapons of genuine technical competence that provided a Japanese squad with automatic fire capability broadly, comparable in raw technical terms to what American squads possessed. The doctrinal difference that mattered was not primarily about the weapons themselves, but about how those weapons were employed within the broader structure of squad and platoon tactics, and about the redundancy and flexibility that American infantry organization built into its automatic weapons employment in ways that Japanese organization, for reasons rooted in both doctrine and the material constraints of Japan's wartime production capacity, did not replicate to the same degree. The American Infantry Squad of 1943 and 1944, organized under the doctrine that had evolved through the early Pacific campaigns and the lessons absorbed from them, typically incorporated not one, but multiple automatic weapons capability at the squad and platoon level, with the bar serving as an organic, integral component of squad firepower rather than a specialized weapon held at a higher echelon and attached only for specific operations. This meant that an American squad moving through jungle terrain carried, as a matter of standard organization, the capability to generate the kind of sudden, concentrated automatic fire that the Japanese squad at the Driniumor River encountered, not as an exceptional reinforcement brought up for a specific assault, but as the default firepower profile of an ordinary infantry unit conducting an ordinary patrol. The redundancy mattered as much as the raw capability. An American platoon typically fielded several bars distributed across its component squads, which meant that the loss or malfunction of any single weapon did not eliminate the platoon's automatic fire capability in the way that the loss of a single light machine gun could disproportionately degrade a Japanese squad's firepower. Given the more centralized and less redundant way Japanese doctrine tended to organize automatic weapons employment at the small unit level. The specific tactical effect that the bar produced, and that Japanese after-action reports across multiple campaigns documented with a consistency that reflects a genuine and recurring tactical surprise rather than an isolated incident, emerged from the combination of the weapon's rate of fire, its man-portability, and the doctrine that trained American riflemen to use it aggressively in exactly the kind of close-range, fast-developing engagement that jungle and island terrain produced with particular frequency. The bar fired at a cyclic rate of approximately 500 rounds per minute, a figure that in isolation tells only part of the story, because American training doctrine emphasized controlled, disciplined bursts rather than sustained automatic fire that would rapidly exhaust the weapon's 20-round magazine and risk overheating the barrel. A trained bar gunner could deliver, within the first several seconds of an ambush or a sudden engagement, a volume of aimed and semi-aimed fire that no single bolt-action rifle, and in many tactical configurations no single Japanese light machine gun position, could immediately match in the specific window of time when the engagement's outcome was typically being decided. The jungle and island terrain of the Pacific Theater amplified this advantage in ways that the open terrain of other theaters might not have to the same degree. Engagement ranges in dense vegetation were frequently extremely short, often under 50 yards, sometimes under 20, which meant that the tactical advantage went overwhelmingly to whichever side could generate the largest volume of effective fire in the first several seconds of contact, before either side had the opportunity to maneuver, to call for supporting fire, or to execute the kind of deliberate, planned tactical response that longer engagement ranges and more open terrain permitted. A Japanese squad advancing through dense undergrowth that suddenly encountered an American position equipped with a bar was in the specific tactical mathematics of that engagement type, facing a weapon whose effect was concentrated almost entirely within the brief window during which surprise and initial volume of fire determined the outcome, and the bar was within exactly that window, disproportionately lethal. Japanese intelligence assessments of American infantry weapons, conducted through 1942 and 1943 on the basis of capture equipment, prisoner interrogation, and the analysis of engagement reports, had identified the bar's existence and had cataloged its basic technical specifications with reasonable accuracy. What those assessments had not fully conveyed to the infantry officers who would actually encounter the weapon in combat was the specific tactical experience of facing it. The visceral, immediate, squad-destroying reality of automatic fire arriving with a suddenness and a volume that theoretical knowledge of the weapon's rate of fire did not adequately prepare a commander to anticipate or counter in the compressed decision-making window that close-range jungle combat allowed. This gap between intellectual knowledge and tactical experience is a recurring theme in the history of military surprise across many conflicts and many technologies, but it manifested with particular sharpness in the Pacific Theater's dense terrain, where the bar's effect was concentrated into engagement windows measured in seconds rather than minutes. The specific incident at the Driniumor River in 1944, documented in both American unit histories and in the post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents from the New Guinea campaign, was not an isolated event but representative of a pattern that recurred across the New Guinea campaign, the various island assaults of the Central Pacific, and the Philippines campaign of 1944 and 1945. Japanese officers reviewing these engagements in their after-action reports returned repeatedly to a specific analytical puzzle: how a single weapon, operated by a single soldier, could produce casualties disproportionate to what the raw technical specifications of the weapon, considered in isolation, would predict. The puzzle's resolution lay not in any single technical characteristic of the bar, but in the accumulated effect of American doctrine, training, organization, and industrial depth that made the bar's ammunition supply, its distribution across squad organization, and the training time invested in each individual gunner all sustainable in a way that Japan's contracting wartime production capacity increasingly struggled to match in its own automatic weapons employment. The ammunition that fed the bar's 20-round magazines, standard .30-06 rifle cartridges, manufactured in the same American factories that produced the ammunition for the M1 Garand and every other American infantry weapon using that caliber, was produced in quantities that reflected the same industrial depth that had been documented across every other technology this channel has examined. A bar gunner in the Pacific Theater carried, as standard load, a substantial supply of loaded magazines, distributed across his own equipment and supplemented by ammunition bearers within his squad, whose specific job was to ensure that the automatic weapon never ran short during a sustained engagement. This logistical redundancy, the deliberate organizational decision to dedicate manpower specifically to keeping a single automatic weapon supplied, reflected an institutional confidence in ammunition availability that Japanese squad organization, operating under the increasingly severe production constraints of 1943 and 1944, found difficult to replicate to the same degree. The training pipeline that produced American bar gunners was, like every other element of American military preparation examined across this channel's episodes, industrialized in a way that ensured a steady supply of competently trained operators even as combat losses required continuous replacement. American infantry training doctrine treated proficiency with the squad's automatic weapons as a core competency that multiple soldiers within each squad were trained to provide, ensuring that the loss of a primary bar gunner did not eliminate the squad's automatic fire capability, but simply required the next trained soldier to take up the weapon. This redundancy in trained personnel, mirroring the redundancy in ammunition supply and in weapons distribution at the platoon level, reflected a systemic depth that the individual tactical encounter at the Driniumor River, considered in isolation, does not fully convey, but that the cumulative pattern of similar engagements across the Pacific Theater makes unmistakable. Japanese military medical and psychological assessments of soldiers who survived encounters with American automatic weapons fire in close jungle engagements documented, with the careful clinical language characteristic of Imperial military reporting, a pattern of psychological response that distinguished these encounters from other forms of combat experience. The suddenness of the casualties, the compression of the engagement into a time frame too brief for the normal processes of tactical decision-making and response to fully engage, and the specific horror of watching a cohesive unit reduced to scattered casualties within seconds rather than through the more gradual attrition that other forms of combat typically produced, generated reactions among surviving Japanese soldiers that their officers found difficult to address through the standard frameworks of military psychological preparation. The training in Gammon, in the disciplined endurance of combat stress that Japanese military culture had cultivated through years of institutional emphasis, addressed sustained hardship and prolonged danger with considerable effectiveness. It addressed less effectively the specific psychological challenge of sudden, total, squad-level destruction occurring within a time frame too brief for the disciplined endurance framework to fully engage before the engagement had already been decided. The tactical adaptations that Japanese infantry doctrine attempted to develop in response to the documented pattern of bar-inflicted casualties reflected the same institutional pattern that this channel has documented across other technologies and tactical developments throughout the Pacific War. Japanese infantry manuals revised through 1943 and 1944 incorporated guidance emphasizing increased dispersion during jungle movement. The designation of specific squad members to identify and prioritize the destruction of automatic weapon positions before they could deliver sustained fire, and modified approach tactics intended to reduce the vulnerability of advancing infantry to the specific kind of sudden, concentrated automatic fire that the bar's tactical employment had demonstrated. These adaptations reflected genuine tactical learning and were not without effect. But they addressed the tactical symptom rather than the underlying material and organizational reality that produced it. Japan could train its infantry to disperse more effectively, to prioritize different targets in the brief window of an ambush engagement, and to approach suspected enemy positions with greater caution. What Japan's wartime production system could not do, given the resource constraints and the industrial disruption that American strategic interdiction was imposing with increasing severity through 1944, was replicate the ammunition abundance, the weapons redundancy, and the depth of trained personnel that made the American bar's tactical effect sustainable across every engagement, on every island, against every Japanese unit it encountered for the remainder of the war. The cartridge belt that ammunition bearers carried into the New Guinea jungle, distributed among multiple men within an American squad so that no single soldier's fatigue or casualty would interrupt the automatic weapon's sustained fire capability, was in this sense the same recurring argument that this channel's previous episodes have traced across the proximity fuse, the airborne depth charge, the long-range drop tank, and the millions of clips that fed the M1 Garand in the forests of Europe. It was an unremarkable piece of canvas and brass, produced and distributed in quantities that reflected an industrial and organizational depth that the Imperial Japanese military, fighting the same war with the same urgency, but without the same productive abundance, increasingly could not match in any single category of equipment or supply, however small or however large. The bar itself was not a wonder weapon. Its lethality emerged from the system that surrounded it. The ammunition that never ran short, the trained gunners who were always available to replace casualties, and the doctrine that had been built with confidence around the assumption that the firepower would always be there when the squad needed it. By the time of the Philippines campaign in late 1944 and early 1945, Japanese infantry units encountering American patrols in jungle and forested terrain had absorbed, through painful and repeated experience, the tactical reality that the Driniumor River engagement had first demonstrated with such stark clarity. The bar was not an occasional threat to be managed through specific countermeasures developed for isolated encounters. It was a structural feature of every American infantry unit's organic firepower, present in every patrol, every ambush, every defensive position, distributed with a redundancy that ensured its continuous availability regardless of individual losses or equipment failures. Japanese infantry officers who survived the war and contributed to post-war oral histories and memoir literature returned, in their reflections on jungle combat against American infantry, to a consistent theme that echoes the broader pattern this channel has documented across the air, naval, and now ground combat dimensions of the Pacific War. They had not been defeated by superior individual courage or superior individual marksmanship in any narrow technical sense. They had been defeated by a logistical and organizational depth that made every individual American soldier's weapon an expression of an industrial system whose abundance never failed to arrive at the precise moment and in the precise quantity that combat required. The squad that the Browning automatic rifle destroyed along the Driniumor River in May 1944 was, in the specific tactical sense, an isolated incident, one engagement among thousands that the New Guinea campaign produced across its grinding, exhausting duration. But in the broader sense that this channel's recurring examination of the Pacific War's technological and logistical dimensions has consistently revealed, it was representative of something far larger than a single tactical encounter. It was the expression, at the smallest possible scale of military organization. A single squad, a single weapon, a single soldier, of the same productive depth that had filled the artillery shells with proximity fuses, that had extended the Mustang's range with disposable fuel tanks, that had kept the B-24s flying their 14-hour patrols over the southwestern Pacific, and that had illuminated the darkened sea with flares dropped from aircraft that never seemed to run short of fuel or crews or the will to keep flying. The bar was simply the version of that argument that arrived in the hands of a single rifleman in a jungle clearing on an afternoon in May, and that argument, delivered in 4 seconds of sustained automatic fire, was sufficient to end the existence of a squad that had trained for years to survive exactly the kind of combat it had just been destroyed by. Freedom does not always announce itself through grand strategic gestures or decisive fleet engagements. Sometimes it arrives in the hands of a single soldier carrying a weapon whose ammunition will never run short, supported by men whose only job is to keep that weapon firing, trained by a system that produces replacements faster than combat can exhaust them. The squad along the Driniumor River had trained with genuine seriousness, fought with genuine courage, and understood the tactical principles of jungle warfare with genuine professional competence. None of that was sufficient against the specific, concentrated, 4-second expression of an industrial and organizational depth that no amount of individual skill could fully counter. The officers who tried to understand how one bar burst had killed a whole squad were asking the right question. The answer was not in the weapon. It was in everything behind it. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. The men who fought in those jungles, on both sides, deserve to be remembered with the precision and care their experience requires. We will keep finding these stories,